Most people know the quote, "the best defense is a good offense," but personally, I reject that notion. I love swinging around a big, girthy sword as much as the next overcompensating gamer, but sometimes it's slow and steady that wins the race. When Elden Ring first came out, I decided to try my hand at a challenge run, and created the shield hero as a result. A shield-only character who relied heavily on a combination of frost and bleed mechanics that are slapped on various shields throughout the game. Since then, I've taken on half a dozen challenge runs and have become much more competent at playing this very challenging game, and I'm interested to see how I've grown. And that's where this DLC comes in. There's no better place to restart my challenge run journey than by dusting off this shield character and sending him into the Shadow Realm. There's one problem though. When I finished this challenge run initially, I thought that I was done with the challenge. I never messed with New Game Plus at all up until that point, so I decided to send this guy to the next difficulty up just to see how challenging it was. I killed a few bosses, decided that I didn't really want to keep going with this run, and then stopped playing the character. That means I basically have to run through the game again, collect bell bearings again, and do a bunch of stuff in the main game that I had already done before. I did most of that stuff off camera just to save us all some time in this video, except for this kill of Radahn that I needed to even enter the DLC, and I think it's nice to look at this fight just to see the difference in the pain that the DLC doles out compared to the base game. Like, yeah, sure, I may have died here, but Radahn doesn't hit very hard at all. This character is built as a tank with tons of strength and tons of endurance, a solid 60 vigor, and the heaviest armor I can muster. Surely with all of that, the DLC won't be so bad, right? Right? Anyway, with Radahn dead once again, it's time to finally challenge this extremely difficult DLC as the one and only shield hero. Let's do this. Entering the DLC is like a dream. Elden Ring is a game that swallowed me whole, and I was almost sad when I had finally explored the entire map and there was nothing left to discover. Shadow of the Erdtree takes that feeling and compounds on it brilliantly. I was just as glued to this new world as I was when I was first discovering the lands between. Unfortunately, this new world suffers from some of the same replayability walls that the base game is bogged down by. The collection chores. I don't have any real need to craft for this run, so cookbooks and materials aren't worth going out of my way for, but this DLC's power scaling mechanic relies on collecting Shadow Tree fragments to boost both your attack power and damage negation while in this world. This mechanic is quite similar to the golden seeds found in the base game, but unlike those seeds, you'll need to find all 50 Shadow Tree fragments to reach maximum potential. That means it's super easy to miss just one or two, and unless you're diligent about marking your map every time you find some, you'll have a difficult time figuring out which fragments you lack. I learned from my first playthrough though, so I make sure to mark my map every time I find a fragment. I don't know how challenging this run is going to be, but I do remember my experience running the base game with the dreadfully slow attack animations of the Great Shields, and I know that I'll need all the help I can get to overcome that. It's busy work, but with a guide and some map markers, it's not so bad. So I spend some time collecting fragments around the first area, and decide to test my mettle against the very first furnace golem that wanders around the graveside plain. These guys have an insane amount of health, and from what I can tell are completely immune to bleed and frostbite. I guess it makes sense, golems don't bleed and this guy is practically made of fire, so yeah, you do the math. The way you're supposed to take these guys down is to knock them down and score a critical hit on their face. It takes a very long time to deal enough stance damage for anything to happen, and the first stance break doesn't even send them to the ground, it's just a minor stun. The second doesn't either, but the third one will send them crashing to the ground. Once its face meets the floor, it's there for a full 30 seconds for you to get in place and score a critical hit for massive damage. And this is the perfect time to remind you that even though shields are incredible at dealing stance damage and causing stance breaks, they can't exactly take advantage of them with a critical hit. Shields just can't do that. The best I can do is just spend the time getting free damage during the stun and hope my stamina bar can last. Anyway, I waste like 7 or 8 minutes killing this guy just to prove that I can. And for my troubles, I get the Sekiro tier. an item that I can mix in my wondrous physic to give me spontaneous blocking capability for 3 minutes. I don't use this nearly as much as I probably should have, but hey, at least the option is there. And with that, I head into Bellerotte to make some progress. The main goal for any legacy dungeon is going to be twofold. First, just make it through. Second is to find and collect any Erdtree fragments that may be hiding in the area. I'm not super familiar with these places yet, so I do waste some time fighting, but I take this time to refamiliarize myself with shield play. I'm actually one of those players who prefers to dodge roll his way through life instead of standing there and taking it on the chin, so holding L1 to block is a bit of a foreign concept to me. All the little fights in this dungeon gave me the perfect opportunity to practice though, and what I found out is that blocking is pretty dang good. These big yellow guys with the big swords and infinite poise were pretty difficult for me to deal with in my casual playthrough, but with the shield I can just stand my ground and punish with a well-timed guard counter at the end of their combos. I can also sneak in jump attacks, and their stance crumbles into dust as we dance back and forth. Anyway, I make it through Bellerotte without much trouble, and then before fighting the boss, I take a detour to collect a few more fragments. Also off camera, I went to collect the fingerprint stone shield that I snubbed in my original run and got it fully upgraded. When I initially did this run, I relied very heavily on frost and bleed procs to carry me through the game. In hindsight, that made things so much easier than I realized. I've grown a lot as a player since this initial run, and am more capable than ever at finding and exploiting boss openings and remaining safe while doing so. Of course, I still make mistakes, but I've gotten pretty decent at this game, so with that in mind, I decide to mostly retire the frost and bleed effects of the past and move on to crushing my foes with a big rock. And for a big rock, this shield hits super hard. And since I'm able to give it some extra strength scaling, it becomes a mainstay of my build for the rest of the run. Its blocking damage negation is some of the highest of any shield in the game across all damage types. It deals massive damage and stance breaks like a champ. What's not to love? Overall, I went into this run with the goal to make it feel a bit different than my original run, and this is a part of that. I want to use a bunch of different shields for different situations to showcase the power and versatility of this weapon type, especially with how it evolves in this expansion. And with the chores done for the time being, and sitting at a healthy Erdtree blessing level of 5, it's time to move on to the first real boss of the run, the Divine Beast Dancing Lion. In general, I think that every new boss in this DLC is, at minimum, very good, except for one towards the end of the game, but we'll get to that. This DLC has some of the best fights in not just the game, but in FromSoft's history. That said, as far as the new Remembrance bosses go, this guy is by far the one that I dislike the most. I have so much trouble wrapping my head around this guy's weird, shrimp-like movements. For two guys in a trench coat, they move much more like a mollusk than any other shellfish in this game. It's actually kind of remarkable. Joking aside, this guy is beyond frustrating for me to fight. His wild moves combine with a not very well optimized lock-on point and a shockingly small collision box to create one of the worst camera situations in the entire game. To add injury to injury, the area of effect attacks on his second phase are incredibly difficult to deal with, especially the lightning phase where it feels like you're just not allowed to attack at all, since he covers most of his attacks with seemingly random lightning strikes. I probably just haven't found the correct dodge patterns, which is entirely likely, but it just feels so completely non-intuitive to me that I very quickly just stop enjoying the fight. Phase 2 is generally not too much trouble. I'm still bad at it, but for the most part his attacks are pretty simple. It's all physical damage, so if I'm positioned well and not stuck in an attack animation, I can block most attacks pretty easily. There's a lot of openings that I can exploit here too, but the most important one is the attack where he basically starts flying, does a double drill through the air towards you, with an explosive landing and finishing with a spin breath. It's a lot to take in, but if you're able to dodge it all and either jump over or dodge the breath at the end, you're gifted with a massive window which I like to use for a fully charged heavy attack. More great moments come from his slow slam attack that creates a small shockwave, and his bite grab attack. If you dodge these, you get a window for a jump attack or a couple of lighter swings. If you don't, well, they kinda hurt. And finally, the Dancing Lion has his own version of Spin to Win. He'll stand up and breathe on the ground, doing 3 revolutions before he stops. This attack is much trickier than I tend to give it credit for in the fight. It's easy enough to jump over or roll through the waves of breath, but the main problem is that the boss continues to move at a pretty quick pace throughout the attack. Half the time, I'd wind up getting chased to an unfortunate part of the arena, causing the camera to sort of freak out and causing me to lose track of where the breath is. If I manage to dodge every wave and remain in an offensive position, I can follow the final dodge with a fully charged attack. My main strategy was to try and make it through Phase 1 as quickly as possible so I can keep practicing and grinding Phase 2. I decided to open with the Coil Shield. It's quick and it doesn't take very long to get the boss poisoned, which helps push through the phase. Once the poison is applied, I stuck to two-handing the Fingerprint Shield for the rest of the fight. I tried to remain patient while taking advantage of openings, and then Phase 2 comes. Phase 2 consists of 3 elements, and each one asks for a completely different defensive strategy to deal with it. The first is lightning, and I don't know who designed this phase, but you and I can't be friends. The main defensive strategy for me in this phase is to dodge and run away. Any opening that I think that I have, except for his spin breath attacks, are covered by lightning strikes that I was never able to suss out the logic for. Running away is all I could do, and it broke my little shield heart because every moment that I'm not attacking is time that the boss has to recover his stance, making a stance break less probable as he keeps up his own aggression. Next up is Frost, where the defensive strategy is jumping. Both this phase and the next phase have relatively safe transitions, where I can move in after the elemental explosion for a beefy attack before he starts being aggressive. This Frost phase is punctuated by AoE ice effects that cover the ground around the boss's attacks. These can be dodged with a tightly timed roll, but for the biggest attacks, the best option is to just jump over the sprouting ice and retaliate. I'm able to mix in some blocks here and there, but I can't do that too much if I want to avoid getting hit by frostbite. And finally is the Wind phase, where blocking is king. Wind damage is purely physical, so this shield can fully block all of the boss's attacks in this phase. This is the best time for me to be aggressive, and I try to make full use of it. The weirdest part of this phase is that he seems to lose his breath attacks, which means he doesn't finish his flying corkscrew attack with a spin breath like he usually does, which ends up confusing me. At a certain point, he'll start doing his ultimate attack where he cycles through all of his elements to make you piss your pants. The dodge pattern isn't too different from his normal corkscrew attack, but it can be tricky. If you make it all the way through and don't mistime the jump to dodge his frost stomp at the end, you're gifted with a nice big window of opportunity to punish him. Pretty much every boss in this game has a way of dropping you into a funnel of death, where you make one mistake and then can't fully recover until you finally die. It's hard to say, and it might just be a lack of experience with these bosses, but it feels like the DLC doubles down on this. It's very easy to get bopped by an attack and then feel the need to flask, but so often the boss will immediately follow up with another attack with less downtime than it takes for your flask animation to end, punishing you for simply trying to stay alive. More than ever, you've got to use some of your biggest attack openings as a healing opening instead, which feels incredibly scary because even sitting at half health in this DLC feels like you're a single breath away from death. And the less confident you are with avoiding a boss's attacks, the more you'll find yourself choosing this panic option over being patient and taking a safer chance to take a drink. It's a vicious cycle and caused a lot of my deaths in this DLC, and especially in this run. This boss is especially evil too, because there's a special aspect to it that many players might miss. I definitely didn't notice this until I started scrubbing through my footage, but if you flask after getting hit with the lion's grab attack, you'll heal it for a huge amount of its health. It's difficult to notice while playing, but it's absolutely brutal. After a lot of frustration, I put the lion down on my 7th attempt. Despite my annoyance, I was finally beginning to understand what exactly the fight wants from me. The lightning phase especially tries to enforce patience and defensiveness, and that's not something that I wanted to do. I've grown too used to rolling in towards the boss for aggressive opportunities, and at certain points of the fight, you get heavily punished for going in so recklessly. As much as I complain about this fight though, it still feels incredible once you understand how to avoid each attack and when to retaliate. The fight is an absolute feast for the eyes, and despite the frustration I felt, it really wasn't as difficult as I'd expected it to be. Maybe this run won't be so hard after all, huh? Alright, one boss down, many more to go. And as hard as that guy was, he's still considered the first boss in this DLC, so that was the easy one. My next target is Rolana, the Twin Moon Knight. But first I want to make a little bit of progress on the map for my future bashings, so instead of rushing straight into Castlewars, I make my way down to the Dragon's Pit cave. I thought this would be easy, but I was wrong on multiple fronts. First, I died a couple times to a boss that isn't even new to the DLC, this magma worm. He really liked to spam his magma charge move, making it really difficult for me to find a way in with my stubby shield range. I didn't even really need to kill this guy, but hey, at least he dropped an ancient dragon smithing stone, so I guess it wasn't a complete waste of time. With that taken care of, I went down to the cave's actual boss and continued to get killed. I really thought this guy was going to be a walk in the park, but it turns out that an ancient dragon man with a big old sword that's faster than my slab of rock is more than a worthy challenge. I was also reminded during the fight that this shield inflicts madness. That's not relevant outside of these NPC-style fights, but it's a nice bonus to keep in mind for a certain fight that'll come later. Eventually, I take down the Dragon Man and then head back to Castlewars, where I rush through as quickly as possible, collecting any fragments along the way, and walk into Rolana's arena without ever actually increasing my blessing level from the previous boss. Rolana might be faster than Keemstar, but I've got a few things going for me. First off, I had to learn this fight pretty well in my casual playthrough, and I've got her more challenging patterns somewhat learned already. Second, I have a giant rock as a shield, so her sword might as well be worthless. Well, I say that, but I still find a way to die 10 times in this fight. Turns out being able to block most attacks doesn't mean anything if your weapon is so slow that you end up trading most of the time. My main problem with this fight was that I had a hard time getting a solid grasp on when her combo string is done. Way too many times I would think that the combo was over, go for a guard counter, and then get force-fed a steel blade for my efforts. Not pleasant. And as useful as this shield was in Phase 1, Rolana's second phase is a completely different story. She lights up her swords and her combos get longer and stronger, and now the elemental damage is going through my block and whittling down my health. Turns out that my reliance on blocking in the first phase is causing problems here, so I've got to get back to dodging. Even though I know this fight decently well, that doesn't exactly mean it's easy. Rolana still does a ton of damage, and it's easy to get wombo comboed into oblivion if I panic. This feels good though, and I know that it's just a matter of time until my brain locks in on her movements and the fight gets solved. Again, I relied on early poison to speed up the first phase, but after that it was pretty much all fingerprint all the time. Her poise is pretty low, so after a few guard counters and jump attacks in quick succession, I can get a sexy stance break, and then try to run her through with shield crash for a big chunk of damage. Sometimes I would just slide off her body though instead of sticking to her, which was annoying, but before long, things started to click into place and I was on a great run until... You know when someone blamed their controller or the game for being bad or stupid or not working right for their own failures? When you look at what they're doing and you can tell that the real problem was them the whole time? Well, this is not one of those times. Once you understand Rolana's Double Moon spell, it's the easiest thing to dodge in the entire world. No need to even get nervous, all you have to do is press the jump button at the right time 3 times in a row, and you're off scot-free. It's not even tight. So I knew that when I saw that spell charging up, that I had basically won this fight. Her health was low, I still had a couple of flasks to my name, and I had full health. This combo leaves a huge opening for me, and I know how to dodge it. I'm calm, collected, and ready to jump. I jumped the first one, and for some reason my character didn't jump on the second press. Most of the time when I get annoyed at a video game, underneath that embarrassing gamer rage, I can recognize where the fault is mine. A lack of timing, or memory, or skill, or whatever. Sometimes it's just about venting. But sometimes you have these moments of absolute clarity and lucidity, where you know that everything you did was absolutely right, and things still don't make sense. Something in the universe just conspired to create your demise, and you're left confused and defeated by the world shifting into a different reality than what you were anticipating. Needless to say, this one made me pretty mad, and I maintain that it wasn't my fault. Oh well, I knew that it was bound to happen soon, so I just kept going, and on the third attempt after that heartbreak, I absolutely demolished her with 8 flasks remaining. It was still much closer than I would have liked at the end there, but at least this fight is finished and I can move on to Shadow Altus, and all the goodies that it offers. I make sure to talk to the NPCs so I can get some of their quests done just in case, and proceed to take a tour of the land to collect as many fragments as I can get my dirty little hands on. Those are great and all, and I managed to find enough around here to get to Blessing level 10, but what I'm really excited about is the prospect of a brand new shield, finally! Up until now, we've been running around with the best that the Lands Between has to offer, but by now it's time to expand our repertoire just a bit and see what the Realm of Shadow has been hiding from us. At the northern end of Rao Base, which can be reached from Shadow Altus by wandering through a few caves, is an abandoned forge. This is a new type of mini-dungeon in Shadow of the Erdtree. These have no bosses, a bunch of smithing stones, and house a new type of weapon from the Smith Script family. These are all throwing weapons, and luckily for us, the Humble Shield is no exception. The Smith Script shield doesn't block very well and it doesn't hit very hard in melee, but its weapon art throws out a fast-moving projectile that's almost impossible to miss. I need a few extra stats to equip it, so after maxing it out at Round Table, I go kill another Forge Golem, and then gobble up the majority of loose runes in my inventory to make ends meet. And just like any good modern developer, I decided to test it in prod, so I equip a Great Shield that doesn't have an Ash of War on it, and head straight in to fight the Golden Hippo at the front of Shadow Keep. The first two attempts here aren't worth talking about, let's just chalk them up to learning moments. The third attempt though is where things get real, and where I fully realize that, yeah, Captain America makes his shield look like it does a lot more damage in melee than mine does. It takes 3 swings with the shield to barely beat out a single toss's damage, and the toss is about 1,000,000 times safer to pull off. I could probably still do more damage with the fingerprint shield, but I'm here to have fun, so we're channeling the cap. I don't have a lot to say about this fight. I think these hippos are a lot of fun to go up against, and this goofy guy is up there with some of my favorites. My only complaint is how difficult it is to properly dodge his bite grab attack, but apparently that was bugged when I did this run, and it was fixed in a patch that came out over the next day or two. But aside from that, I just did my dodging and blocking thing while wailing on the boss from both near and far range. Something I didn't realize until way later, which would have made this fight take way less time, is that the shield toss actually does damage multiple times. It hits on its way out of your hand and during its projectile phase. I could have been stacking up a ton of damage in melee range if I had known this before, especially with all the knockdowns I scored using guard counters and shield bonks. I got him down pretty comfortably on the 3rd try, but it would have been probably only 3 minutes instead of 6 had I known this. Oh well, after the fight, I'd spent some time playing with the shield some more against these dudes outside of the Hippo's arena, and I've gotta say, it's endlessly fun knocking these guys off ledges with a throwing shield. In general, this shield was an incredible tool for the rest of the game, not just for certain boss fights where the extra range came in handy, but for some of the more dangerous enemies like the Fire Knights inside of the storehouse. In my casual playthrough, these guys seemed like they could poise through anything I threw at them. But apparently I should have just tried throwing a shield instead because they literally can't fight back. It's great. And at only 3 FP per toss, I can do this for a very long time. Anyway, I make my way through Shadow Keep, making sure to make a pit stop at the secret route that leads to the Abyssal Woods for later, and talking to the NPCs so I can progress their quest lines. Doing Freya's questline gets me the Golden Lion Shield, a surprisingly sturdy medium shield with 100% physical damage negation, though it suffers from low negation on everything else. It has a pretty fun weapon skill that's good at knocking enemies down, but unfortunately its damage is lacking big time. Despite almost capping it out in upgrades, the damage is pitiful, and the weapon skill just costs too much FP to be worth spamming. So after testing it out a bit, it goes straight back into the backpack, never to be used again. I even went out of my way to find a somber bell bearing that I was missing just for this thing. What a waste. Oh well. I continue my way through the storehouse, reach Messmer's arena, and then I realize that I missed something very important. Weirdly enough, this storehouse is home to not just one shield, not just 2, but 3 different shields exclusive to this DLC. The first one is garbage and we already went over it, but the next 2 are very important. One of them is only accessible from the Church District entrance, but this next one isn't. This is the Dueling Shield. Naturally, I immediately max it out, slap a heavy affinity on it, and jump straight into Messmer's arena to test it out. I adore this fight. Messmer is very aggressive with long, silly combos, but they're all so deliberate and well telegraphed that it's hard to be mad at letting yourself get hit by anything. Some of the combos feel really tricky to figure out how to dodge, but honestly this dude is like a sexier Moog that doesn't wet the floor, and it's awesome. The first few attempts are spent relearning the fight and learning how this new shield works. To my surprise, this thing hits almost as hard as the fingerprint shield while being so much faster and safer to swing as a result. There's 2 unfortunate aspects to this thing though, well 3 depending on who you ask. First is that it doesn't have nearly the stance damaging capabilities of a normal shield. On my 4th attempt with this weapon, despite how much I wailed on Mesmer with it, I didn't bring him down a single time. The second is that a charged heavy seems to be just as slow as the fingerprint shield's charged heavy attack. If it's not, it's pretty dang close. And the third downside is that, well, this thing is just kind of a normal weapon, but better. Better might be a stretch, but it does have a crazy property of actually blocking things during your attack animation with it, which is just absolutely wild. I don't think I was able to capture that in this fight versus Mesmer, but it does happen occasionally in some fights later on in the run. But because of all these downsides, despite how good it actually is, I decided that I'd rather just keep using the fingerprint shield as my main squeeze. This is a shield-only challenge after all, and while this thing is technically within the rules, it feels dirty to use exclusively, so I'll just force myself to use it only when it can fulfill a purpose that no other shield in my arsenal can. It's too much like a normal weapon. So on the 5th attempt, I'm back to two-handing Old Faithful, and really fishing for jump attacks, charged heavies, and guard counters whenever Mesmer will let me get away with it. There's something I need to try with this new shield though, and once I get my first knockdown, I move in to give it a try, and completely fumble the controls. Well, that's embarrassing. I'm really fishing for these guard counters though, and every time I know he's terminating a combo with a high recovery attack, it's the fingerprint shield's time to shine. Fighting this way, it's not too long before I get a second knockdown and, oh yeah, this thing can critical hit. One of the biggest weaknesses of the shield-only style is that the shields can't critical hit, but now we're cooking. With the fingerprint shield to knock enemies down, and the dueling shield to take advantage of that state, we've got a winning recipe. There is a bug with critical hits during boss fights though that kind of gets annoying. A lot of boss phase changes will teleport you to a specific spot in the arena, but if you're in a critical hit animation when the phase change happens, you won't get teleported for whatever reason. It's interesting that From never bothered to fix this bug because it was definitely a thing in the base game. In this fight, it's not a big deal, but it really is a huge deal in some other fights where you're expecting to start in a very specific location after the phase change. Anyway, I did die on this attempt, but it wasn't because of that. Mesmer's Phase 2 is pretty interesting. He weaves in snake anamorph attacks into his combos, but these attacks are also pretty easy to dodge most of the time. There is one big snake finisher that is a bit trickier since it has a lingering hitbox, but for the most part, Mesmer is overall much slower in this phase. His snakes hit really hard, but just don't get hit, right? The unfortunate part is that in general, he's much harder to hit with a guard counter in this phase. In fact, he's a lot harder to safely hit with a weapon that's as slow and as short range as this shield is. But on the 7th attempt, despite the short range, Mesmer goes down. I don't remember what blessing level I was on, and I don't think I recorded it here, but I think I was at 11, maybe? Super fun fight, and I'm sad that it's over, but it's time to move on. I could go burn another tree right now, but I think it's time for some detours first. With Mesmer dead, the end of the DLC is in sight, but there's so much left to do and so many bosses left to kill. The first thing I want to do though is grab the other thrusting shield in this area, but to do that I have to take the scenic route. I head to the Morth Ruins in Shadow Altus to jump into a big hole in the ground and I die. Trying again, I take the correct route this time and head up a ladder to find myself in Bonnie Village, where I immediately head north to collect the Oh Mother pose for later. I then go east across some bridges and then north to a grace, and then finally a detour for this detour to the Freaky Finger Church to start a quest, and then finally back north to the church district of Shadow Keep. I jump across some rooftops and bully some locals with the blunt end of a frisbee, and then drain the church before I find my way to the elevator leading to the other half of the storehouse, where the Carrion thrusting shield is waiting for me. 25 upgrades later, and I find out that this shield is actually not as good as the one I already had. The damage is close, and honestly, if an enemy is weak to magic, it might be better, but in my brief test against this knight, it was a bit worse than the dueling shield. A bit disappointing, but oh well, at least we tried. Now it's off to have a sightseeing tour of the southern portion of the map. I teleport to that dragon pit grace we unlocked earlier and make my way down the corpse of this massive dragon down to Kara's hidden grave. Here I kill a hippo for a fragment and that's it. That's the only important thing here. I then teleport to the river and make my way south down to the Cerulean coast. I collect a few fragments and other items down here, but the main destination right now is this gigantic hole at the bulbous end of this strangely phallic peninsula and dive inside. This is the Fissure, home to a couple more fragments and, more importantly, the next remembrance boss, the Putrescent Knight. This orphan of Kos-looking freak over here was probably one of the most intimidating bosses at first glance. My initial reaction was that this water was slowing me down, and that this guy was way too fast and aggressive, but neither of those things are actually true. This dude practically never stops rushing around the arena, just like when your pet gets the zoomies and it makes the fight feel really chaotic until you begin to understand his patterns. That's when you realize that this guy's just a big old bony teddy bear. He just wants a hug, but he keeps forgetting that he doesn't like being touched and runs off. Truthfully, he doesn't have very many attacks, and they're all pretty simple to dodge. Even his most intimidating attack, where he leaps off his horse, has a very simple and reliable dodge pattern, and once you see it, you can't miss it. Just dodge forward through him or his horse every time, and you'll be fine. If you want to be spicy, you can dodge backwards towards where he's going with tighter timing for an extra aggressive position. And since I want to take this fight with short, stubby shields, I probably want to be very aggressive here. Overall, as much as I enjoy this boss, this first attempt was kind of frustrating. This dude moves a lot during his attacks, so it can be hard to sneak in a hit with such a slow, stubby weapon. I whiffed so many swings, and I just felt like I wasn't accomplishing much. As bad as it felt, I don't think I was doing all that badly, at least until I mistimed some jumps over the boss's fire and got mixed by yet more fire. That got me to thinking though, why bother relying on melee? I have the perfect tool for such an evasive boss. But before I really get the chance to test it, I get summoned to another world. This whole time I've been playing, I've had the blue Sentinel ring on. This is the third and final time I was ever summoned for PvP in this run, but the first two summons weren't very interesting. This one though, well, it shows just how powerful this shield can be when your opponent isn't expecting it. Also, it just makes me laugh that they fell off the cliff. I totally wasn't expecting that. And with that done, I jump down the pit to try again and focus on finding ranged openings on top of my melee openings. With this strategy, I felt so much more in control of the fight. The ability to plink away at bosses with some reliable range damage can't be overstated. It's really powerful, and it's so nice to have a ranged tool that doesn't take a full year to pull off, like the One-Eyed Shield Fireball spell does. So, this boss learned what it's like to be a Fire Knight in a storehouse by repeatedly getting domed by a frisbee till he died. Again. But with him out of the way, I can finally find the source of all this sludge and putrescence. Oh, gamer girl bathwater? Don't mind if I do. If I drink enough of it, maybe she'll finally talk to me. Surprisingly enough, this is a strategy that doesn't work in the real world, but it does work pretty well in video games, and I make the nearby simp angry as a result, furthering his quest line, just in case. Before I leave this coast for good, I ride on down to Snaketown to blow a giant finger for the Crimson Seed Talisman +1 to make my flasks heal for more. And to end our little adventure in the south, we head back to the Dragon Pit Terminus site of Grace one last time and start climbing Jagged Peak. Up, and up further, ignoring various dragons along the way, and up further still to camp ourselves at the arena of the mightiest dragon of them all, at only Blessing level 13, Baal the Dread. Baal the Dread is a spectacle plain and simple. Big boss, big arena, big damage, big health pool. Big as he is though, he's surprisingly hard to hit. Just like every other boss in this DLC, Baal is hyper-aggressive. High aggression plus slow weapon equals few openings, so I have to take what I can get. Here are some of my favorite attacks to punish. The easiest is when he flies up into the air for a stomp. A fully charged heavy will pulverize the hamburger meat he calls a leg. For the next attack, he'll jump over you and then do a backwards tailspin. Sometimes his head ends up where you're already charging a heavy attack if you dodge properly. Both versions of the fire breath that he shoots forward is pretty easy to punish if you're next to him, which in and of itself is pretty rare. Less rare is his downward breath, which you can charge through as it's ending for a jump attack against the head. This window is pretty tight though. The lunge bite grab is pretty easy to dodge and leaves a nice window to retaliate. And finally, the lightning stab into the ground, at least during phase 1, is slow enough for me to get a quick attack in. Despite his high aggression, Bale has quite a few generous openings to take advantage of. The biggest problem here though is that despite all these openings, this shield can't really reach all of them. I think that every time I charged in to punish his flame breath, my jump attack just came up short. I could wait a bit longer to swing, but that window is tight enough as it is. And this just kept happening. The stubby range of the shield meant that so many juicy windows of opportunity went unpunished, and not for lack of trying. The way his head moves just spells bad news for my shield's range. So, after a full 9.5 minutes of trying, I finally died to a stray bit of bullshit fire from Bale's flame breath, and decided that maybe I should try something else. And that's when the dueling shield came out. And from here, it was smooth sailing. In less time than it took for me to get Bale to half health with the fingerprint shield alone, I was able to completely kill him with the dueling shield. The extra reach made it so that every attack that missed before connected with its target this time, and the fight was over in just 8 minutes. Honestly though, I kind of regret resorting to the shield after just a single attempt. It would have been kind of painful to keep going with the stubby range, but I probably could have figured it out. But hey, a shield is a shield, and this was absolutely the correct tool for this job. Next, I fight a furnace golem for absolutely no real reason, and then continue my journey down to the Abyssal Woods by following some cliffs down the river, fighting a few hippos along the way to collect even more fragments. I make my way through the dark catacombs, blocking the way into the forest below, and take advantage of the dueling shield's backstab ability and the Smith Script shield's ranged capabilities to take out the Elder Inquisitor boss at the end of the line. Welcome to the Abyssal Woods, my vote for the absolute worst place in the entire game. I think that Elden Ring, in general, has a bit of a replayability problem. Not like other games do, but a problem that's unique to Elden Ring's world because after all, so many of us are happily playing this game again and again with new characters and new Game Plus cycles. The game's core gameplay is amazing and worth continuing to explore, but the world itself unfortunately isn't. I've seen many people argue that Elden Ring's world, once you've explored it once and the wonder is gone, is a waste of space and effort, and I have to wholeheartedly disagree. The world is designed to be experienced, and the power of that experience as you're letting your curiosity guide you through the lands between is one of the most captivating feelings in gaming, at least for me. Exploration and discovery is one of the biggest reasons why I play video games, and Elden Ring's world is such a masterclass in that sort of design. It doesn't matter so much that the rewards are kind of lame at the end of it all sometimes, or that a reward might not be relevant for your build. But it's still exciting to explore and collect things. Finding something useful is just a nice bonus. It's true that once your first playthrough is complete, the world loses its magical quality that kept you sucked in for so long. It's solved now, and replaying the game means ignoring dozens of optional caves and areas that just don't have any use to you anymore. But that doesn't extinguish your first time experiencing the game's world. I think people that argue that the game's world was a big waste of development time and game space aren't remembering the powerful feeling of being captivated by every little thing this game has to offer. Not everything needs to be endlessly replayable, and not every aspect of a replayable game needs to be replayable in itself either. And I think that Elden Ring strikes a nice compromise between the two. Of course, there are exceptions to this, such as the seemingly endless chores of creating a new character and getting it ready for a new game, like collecting cookbooks and golden seeds, and the threat of having to fight the Godskin duo again. But in general, Elden Ring is perfectly replayable despite its size. I went on this tangent to talk about two things. Firstly, it's the Shadow Tree fragments. There are exactly 50 in the DLC, and you need all 50 to maximize your blessing level. I wish these were more like the golden seeds, where the world has more than enough to cap out the amount of flasks that you can carry. You can miss a few and still be at full power at the end of the game, which is very nice. There's an exact amount of sacred tears for maximum flask power, but these are much easier to find and placed in churches that are visible on the map, and for the most part, on your direct path. And on top of that, there's only 12 of them, so it's not a big deal to go out of your way a little bit just to collect them. Shadow Tree fragments, on the other hand, are very easy to miss in this massive DLC, and I think having 10 or so more than what's actually required to max out could have helped the experience a lot, especially for repeat playthroughs so you wouldn't have to go quite as out of your way to collect your power boosts. And the second thing I wanted to talk about is this area right here, the Abyssal Woods. Despite how much I talked up the first-time experience of this game, I hate this place. First-time experiences are powerful, but very few places are built for the first-time experience as explicitly as this horror-themed zone. This place houses a remembrance boss and 3 fragments, so it's not exactly optional if you want to fight all the bosses and get to the maximum blessing level. It's not exactly a bad zone on its own, but it feels dreadfully underbaked as an experience compared to the rest of the game. Sure, places like Karu's Hidden Grave and the Finger Ruins are relatively empty for their size, but for an exploration-heavy game like this, I don't think that literally every place needs to be so densely packed with content. Sometimes the spectacle is good enough on its own. But what makes the Abyssal Woods so miserable is that not only is it large and relatively empty, but you're forced to travel it without your horse while avoiding enemies that are invulnerable to damage unless you score a difficult-to-land parry that will almost certainly one-shot you if you miss it. This drags the pacing of the zone down to a dreadful crawl, which is actually quite a bit scarier than the horror elements are themselves. As you move through the zone, you can feel kind of aimless amongst the samey-looking walls of this forested labyrinth that seems pointless until you finally stumble upon the ultimate goal, Midra's Manse. A short but really fun legacy dungeon that ends in one of the coolest bosses in this game, Midra. As incredible as both the journey and destination are for the environmental storytelling aspects, the Abyssal Woods will be the place I dread returning to most for each run. It's lucky that this boss is so great though. An incredible lead-up, a grotesque introduction, and a spectacular fight that pops with color, and it's so much fun to fight. Trying to keep up with variety, I attempted to use one of my old flame shields for this fight. They deal similar damage when wielded as a weapon, but I want them mostly for their weapon arts. Initially, I tried the one-eyed shield with the fireball cannon, and eventually switched to the flamethrower, and once I realized how worthless and slow the flamethrower was, I decided to switch back to the one eye mid-fight, because even though it's slower, it's at least much more impactful. As a nice bonus, this boss has a decent number of attacks that you can guard counter and plenty of openings to take advantage of, and at least one attack that's a perfect candidate for a juicy fireball. And, like the idiot I am, I decide to finish the fight with a very unsafe fireball instead, when I could have just waited for a good opening, or just finished the boss like a normal person. Just to try to look cool. Did it work? Did I look cool? Please clap. With the southern half of the map thoroughly conquered, it's time for the boss rush. I've got everything set up to just plow through the remaining bosses as quickly as possible, so it's time to do just that. First, I head back to the Freaky Fingy Church to get the next map, and then make my way up and down through the other part of the storehouse to reach Gaius. But instead of fighting him, I pay my respects to the Marika statue nearby with the pose I found in Bonnie Village all that time ago to open the way to Fingertown and the Shaman Village. I head down to the Finger Ruins and get bullied by some snakes before blowing another finger, and then head back to the Freaky Fingy Church one last time to blow one more finger and fight the Freaky Fingy Queen herself, Meter. For this fight, I just used the fingerprint shield and played Finger Slammed in the Door Simulator until it was almost dead, and decided to use my dueling shield for the finishing blow. At some point I realized that the Ash of War on this shield is pretty worthless for this playstyle because it's literally just a skill that allows you to swing your shield while it's in your left hand. Kinda lame. The Carian Thrusting Shield is a pretty neat Ash on it though, called Giant Hunt, so I decided to switch them out. At least the Carian Shield wasn't completely worthless this way. So my goal was to finish the boss with a Giant Hunt. I get a knockdown with my car door and land a crit with the dueling shield. From here, it should just be one Giant Hunt to finish her off, so I move in, wind up, and she sidesteps the attack, and then proceeds to dodge around like a lunatic before finally fondling me to death. Embarrassing. No big deal, I got exactly what I wanted on the next attempt anyway, taking advantage of her extremely long landing animation as she recovers from the big death laser attack that I never quite figured out. Next up is Baby Radon, the boar rider Gaius. This guy is pretty much 100% physical damage, so blocking is very powerful in this fight. Plenty of opportunities for jump attacks and guard counters, and a few pretty convenient knockdowns for the dueling shield to shine. I'm still not sure that I understand Gaius' patterns all that well, but hey, that's a problem for the next run. For now, I just accept my prize of 5 Shadow Tree fragments, and then head back to the Church District to make my way down to the Demon Sunflower, the Shadow Tree avatar. I've been looking for an opportunity to use this flamethrower shield, and I guess burning a plant is about as good of an opportunity as I'm gonna get. Luckily, this thing's attacks are mostly pretty simple, but the fight can be a bit of a slog. The Sunflower's head is obviously its weak point, but it has a nasty habit of moving out of the way almost every time you try to attack it, so I spend a lot more time attacking the stump than anything else. I'm making pretty good progress, and I found out that the flamethrower can do pretty good damage if you let it rock, and the blocking action that happens while it's shooting can help protect you from retaliation. Really not a bad choice of weapon for this boss, all things considered, and the extra range of the flames means that I can hit the head pretty reliably. Phase 1 is easy. The Sunflower mostly just sits there and takes a beating. Phase 2 is a bit annoying, since it likes to charge around and fling projectiles and thorns at you, but it's still pretty manageable. Phase 3, though, is dangerous, if only for the ridiculous power of the holy explosion that it uses in this phase. It really caught me off guard and killed me, which prompted me to equip a holy damage negation talisman, only to realize that I forgot to pick it up from the shaman village. So I went to grab that, put it on, and went back to purge the plant with fire once and for all. I can't believe how satisfying this fight was with this weapon. 10 out of 10, would recommend. Now it's finally time to get back to progress and head to the ancient ruins of Vrau, where I take a little bit too long to find all the fragments and make my way to the area's boss, the obligatory Quelaag stand-in. This is Romina, Saint of the Bud. I know this boss has some long recovery animations where I can't reliably move in for an attack because of exploding butterflies, which makes me think that it's the perfect opportunity to use Old One Eye once again. This boss has a lot of health, but at this point, I'm doing a crazy amount of damage with each swing. Each jump attack hits for about 1500, and a fireball deals almost 2800. Her attacks are mostly easy to avoid, but I end up taking a lot of hits due to my own greed. The damage mitigation is crazy though with all this endurance I've been stacking for heavier armor, and the trades I take wind up being not a huge deal. Even the Scarlet Rot wasn't all that scary, and I decided to end it all with just one last fireball to put her down for good. And this time I did not get punished for my hubris. Nice. And as a bonus after the fight, I discovered a very unfortunate animation that happens when you spam block with this shield. I guess the shield hero must really like insects with the torso of a woman. But hey, I ain't gonna kink shame somebody who can clearly beat me up, so let's just ignore that and commit arson on a nearby tree instead so we can finally explore the final area, Anir Elim. It's all come to this. One final area and 2 more fights. Of course, I know exactly what's coming up, so I go out of my way to collect all of the Shadow Tree fragments that remain in this zone, even the one past the devious jumping section, to reach a maximum Shadow Tree blessing of 20, and venture towards another obligatory FromSoft moment, the Gank Squad. Needle Knight Leda is a huge pain to fight, and honestly, taking this fight on solo is probably the hardest fight in this game. NPC fights are always a bit tricky because of how they move and dodge, but this fight is ridiculous. Each NPC's health is insanely high, and each of them have a flask charge that's difficult to prevent the use of. But I have a secret weapon up my sleeve. You didn't think I'd come here without help, did you? No, I'm not talking about Tjolje, nor am I talking about Ansbach, as incredible as that old man might be. No. I'm calling in the boys for this fight, my own gank squad of shield heroes past, come to wall out the oppressors and help carry me to victory. That's right, throughout this journey, I've been collecting any revered ashes in my way and taking the time out to collect grave gloveworts to level these boys up, just to bring them in for this fight. And I've gotta say, it's very satisfying watching these guys crowd around an NPC that can't do anything to respond. They're unfortunately pretty weak though, and don't do a lot of damage by themselves. They're just a distraction while I try to take out as many NPCs as possible. Freya has a ton of health and takes a while to kill, but Hornsent fortunately dies pretty quickly. With those two dead, I still have to deal with Dane and Leda, who just don't let up on their aggression. It's hard to get any attacks in with how quickly they can close in, and both of them have attacks that close distance pretty well and make running away more difficult than it is in most other fights. With all the moving parts here, this fight is brutally difficult for what it is, and I think it's probably the actual worst fight in this entire game, mechanically speaking. Lore-wise, it's great, but fighting 4 NPCs, each with a heal, insane damage, and unrealistic vigor standards for a normal player character is not a fun fight. The first 2 attempts don't go particularly well, both ending in a 2v1 against Dane and Leda after my boys die. The third attempt goes much better though, where I fully abuse the power of Shield Crash and the Shield's Madness effect to stun-lock the enemies and deal massive damage. I get pretty lucky and find myself shoving Dane into a corner while Leda finishes off what remains of the boys. And by the time she's ready to deal with me, Dane is a single hit from death. He's easy enough to finish off, but Leda is still a nightmare to deal with. Her weapon is faster than the fingerprint shield can realistically deal with, and if I was smarter about it, I would have swapped to either the dueling shield or the Captain America for a quicker, safer option. I was eventually able to kill her though, and with the gank squad finally behind me, it's time to mentally prepare for the ass-beating that is about to ensue. Radahn's Phase 1 does not have very many openings for the fingerprint shield, but there are a few big ones that matter. The first and easiest is his corkscrew dive attack that he likes to open up with. This is incredibly easy to dodge and leaves enough time for a fully charged heavy attack to punish him. Second is the combo string that ends in a slam that breaks the ground. You can sneak behind him after the final dodge to charge a heavy before he can retaliate. This is one of his favorite combos, and it's super easy to recognize once you know what you're looking for, and is by far the most reliable way to sneak in damage. Third is his second bread and butter combo attack, the one where he spins like a little ballerina and winds up swinging way over your head and ends with some wide swings. This opening is much smaller and doesn't always terminate the same way. So most of the time when I tried to take advantage of this with the fingerprint shield, I got punished instead. Fourth, if you end up behind him, he likes to slide away and follow up with a jumping attack. This happens most often after his groundbreaking attack and results in a large punish window, but sometimes he'll mix you up and do it twice. If you're too hasty and he decides to do the second jump, you're gonna eat a big hit. It's not difficult to react to his lack of follow-through with an attack of your own when you know it's safe though, and still get away unscathed. If you have a faster weapon, you can always do a light attack after your initial roll and still have enough time to roll from his second attack, if he chooses to do it. And finally, Radahn's dumbest, most annoyingly designed attack, the cross-slash combo. This thing seems practically unreactable and is the one attack in the entire game that nearly everybody is in agreement on being completely unreasonably designed. If you dodge the first hit, the second slash will almost always hit you. You just don't have time to react to it. Fortunately for me, I have a shield, and if I'm holding block instead of trying to dodge, I can stay quite safe against it as long as I don't run out of stamina. The best part is though, if I am positioned well and don't get hit by the final swing of the attack, he leaves himself wide open for a pretty huge punish, which is a nice reward for surviving this brutally quick attack. Phase 2 doesn't actually change much in the way of viable openings to punish. I'm looking for all the same attacks, but now my dodges just have to be a bit more precise, I can't block quite as much, and I have some extra dangerous new attacks to watch out for. There's a lot to hate about this phase, and I do think that it needs to be toned down, both visually and aggression-wise, but by far my least favorite attack in this phase is his arena-wide area of effect attack that he charges up. Basically, if you're stuck in any animation when he begins his cast, and you aren't immediately running away from the center, you will get hit. The window for escape is balanced on a razor's edge, and it's just simply too tight. That window you thought was safe to flask or reload your crossbow? Idiot, prepare to get blasted. I don't know, maybe it is possible to avoid damage if you end up getting stuck in this damage zone, but I was never able to figure it out. Maybe it's worth using a bubble tier and a physic to tank a hit on such an occasion, but I never did that. Regardless, this attack is dumb, and I would also like to see it tweaked. Maybe have the spell start centered on Radahn instead of the player so there's a shorter distance to run away? I don't know. But for now, we've just gotta deal with it as it is. After 2 attempts, I decided that I'm kinda sick of trading with Radahn as often as I am, and I bust out the dueling shield for my main attacking weapon. With the extra speed and reach, I can sneak in damage much more easily during Radahn's combos, and get punished less for jump attacks on his smaller openings. With this shield, I can weave in an attack in the middle of his ground break combo, and even follow up with an extra light attack at the very end of it. His other spinny combo also has a brief opening towards the end, and is mostly safe whether or not he decides to swing an extra time. Between his long attack chains, a bad habit of holding block that I built up over the course of this run, and my desire to sneak in swings between dodges, I was actually starting to have some stamina issues during this fight. So after about 7 attempts over 40 minutes, I decided that I'll go gather one last tool, the 2-headed dog talisman. This is just like the 1-headed one, but better. It should solve most of my stamina problems, but unfortunately I have to trade away the Crimson Seed +1 talisman to use it. Just, don't get hit, right? Easy. I head back, and it's another 4 attempts over 10 minutes before I realize that, hey, I'm not utilizing one of my strongest tools, the Giant Hunt Ash of War. I put this skill on for a reason after all, and what better way to kill a giant man than with a skill called Giant Hunt? And let me tell you, this was the ticket. Radahn is incredibly challenging to stance break. Between his high poise and recovery values and the brutally long combo strings that force you to remain defensive, it's a rare treat to see him taken to the ground. Even with the power of a giant slab of rock, it just wasn't happening very often, and once I switched to the dueling shield as my main form of offense, it wasn't really happening at all. But with Giant Hunt, all that changed. This skill deals a large amount of damage and a huge amount of poise damage, and using this skill on the larger openings, I was able to consistently score a knockdown in Phase 1. And even if I didn't, I could be very aggressive at the start of Phase 2 and smack him with a Giant Hunt as my opener, which was usually enough to bring him over the edge and knock him down to the ground. Even without abusing the silly overpowered shield poke technique of the thrusting shields that was recently patched out, this shield is still extremely powerful and very versatile. And the way that this fight went on my winning attempt makes it look like it's still very broken as a normal weapon. It's still a hard-fought victory in the end, but this shield almost made it feel easy. Just ignore the fact that it took an hour worth of attempts to end up with this incredible run that I won on, and I still even got hit by a grab at the beginning of the second phase. But hey, at least I got to finish the fight with this sick crown on my head, right? What's even crazier to me is the fact that on the winning run, I scored 2 knockdowns over the course of the fight, one in the first phase and one again in Phase 2. Everything just lined up brilliantly, and before too long, the final boss of the DLC was finally behind me. Oh man, what a ride. This was extremely fun, especially once I started collecting the DLC's new shields and began playing around with all the tools I've collected over these runs. It turns out that shields are incredibly capable weapons, and the DLC just boosts their power to insane heights that I never even thought I'd experience from this type of weapon. Imagine how much easier it would have been if I was stacking Bleed and Frost on the shields just like last time too. Normally, I would suggest that people not take on any of my challenge runs, but this one is different. I think playing with a shield under normal circumstances is actually kind of boring, but going all in on the shield-only style in this way is quite exciting in how it forces you to make the most of the tools that you have available to you. And there's so many different types of shields with fun and quirky effects that you have a tool for just about any occasion, especially now that the thrusting shield and the throwable shield exist. But hey, that's the shield run. Honestly, after my casual playthrough, I was kind of scared of what this challenge might do to me, but I'm pleasantly surprised. The first run is always the hardest, and shields are pretty strong at a base level. And to be honest, I'm quite a bit better at this game and this style of game than I was when I first started doing these challenge runs. Even with that, I almost want to say that this run was easier than my casual playthrough, But maybe that's just the experience talking. Most of the learning was already done by the time I started this run, so that definitely helped a lot. Anyway, I want to thank my patrons, of course, for funding all of this madness, and you for watching all the way through. If you made it this far, I want you to sneak in the word thrust in your comment so I know that you're a real one. Time to get started on the next run, and I hope to see you there. Bye-bye.